Hi, this is Paul. Kristen DeMay, who's a professor of history at Calvin University. It's hard for me to say Calvin University. I keep wanting to say Calvin College because that's what I've been saying for years. Hard to teach the old dog new tricks. Put out a tweet today, which actually got a lot of really interesting and helpful response. Is there a smart piece anywhere that spells out when and how social justice became demonized? Asking for a friend. Really? As in, a friend just texted me this question. It's actually a great question because I myself noticed this. Social justice for me, for most of my lifetime, was sort of a fine category. And really, for me, a more interesting question is, when did this term really arise? A number of people, so I made a list actually of some of the tweets that I thought were helpful, and you can find that on my blog. I'll put a link to it down below. And so a number of people mentioned the relationship between social justice and Rauschenbusch's social gospel. So I thought it was a very interesting question, and it was sometime in the last little while that the term went from being a term that was sort of a positive thing to a negative thing in many churches. The first hint I had of this actually happened, I think, in our classis when we did a classis reorganization, and we had a team that focused on social justice, and they were going to be called, we're looking at names for these classical committees, and the name was going to be the Social Justice Committee, and a number of members of classis objected. And it kind of took me aback because I had never heard any pushback on this term at all, and eventually the team in classis became the Micah 6:8 team, out of that famous do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with your God text from the book of Micah. So that's a really interesting question, and I found the answers quite interesting, and it spurred on more thought. One question will be, hasn't the church always been about social justice? Now, again, we're talking about the term here. You'll notice in the book of Galatians, for example, when Paul is dealing with the questions of circumcision and Jewish dietary laws with respect to Gentile converts, for God, who was at work in Peter as an apostle to the circumcised, was also at work with me as an apostle to the Gentiles. James, Cephas, and John, those esteemed as pillars, gave me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship when they recognized the grace given to me. They agreed that we should go to the Gentiles, and they to the circumcised. All they asked is that we should continue to remember the poor, the very thing I had been eager to do all along. Now, there's a very interesting conversation in New Testament scholarship to the degree that the poor is reference to the believers in Jerusalem. And there's a very interesting animated movie called A Polite Bribe. You can find it on Amazon, which goes into some of that. It's a very interesting theme because Paul will go about for the collection for Jerusalem and pick that up. And a lot of some New Testament scholars believe that Paul was doing this in order to sort of smooth out the relationships between the circumcised and the uncircumcised. Now, the church very quickly was doing a lot of acts of social benevolence. Now, again, some of you will have problems with the term social justice, so fair enough. Use whatever term you want. Public justice is perhaps a better term. And of course, there's this very famous letter to a pagan high priest. It's disgraceful when no Jew ever has to beg, and the impious Galileans support not only, meaning the Christians, support not only their own poor, but others as well. All men see that our people lack aid from us. Teach those of the Hellenic faith to contribute to the public service of this sort, and the Hellenic villages to offer their first fruits to the gods, and accustom those who love the Hellenic religion to those good works by teaching them that this was our practice of old. In other words, part of the reason Christianity is outpacing and overwhelming the Roman Empire is because of Christian generosity to the poor. And today, if you look at very red state conservative churches, you will find them to be very generous to the poor often. And that's one of the issues I had with Nicholas Kristof's article because, and he had made this point in an article a number of years ago when he went to Africa and found that they, for the most part, were missionary doctors who were caring for the poor in Africa. And many of those missionary doctors are coming from very conservative Christian churches. It's pretty well known. In the world's consumption, in the church's consumption of the Roman Empire, benevolence to the poor was an integral factor. Constantine inherited not just a religion to contain the cost of polytheism, but a social safety net too. Now, this wasn't just about good morality that people would say, well, we don't mind it so much when Christians help the poor, even conservative Christians, but there was a sexual ethic that was connected with Christianity that was highly countercultural. And you can read it in Kyle Harper's excellent From Shame to Sin, Christian Transformation of Sexual Morality in Late Antiquity, and you can hear about it with Unbelievable's conversation between Tom Holland and Tom Wright. That was really the first time Tom Holland got on my radar screen. Hasn't the church always been about social justice? Well, if you look at the American church, the Northern American church, in the victory of the Union over the South in the Civil War, launched a host of progressivists that were almost always Christian nationalist in terms of their conceptualization. And they were quite unified before the modernist fundamentalist split. You know, issues like child labor laws, prohibition, and the temperance movement. And you can read a lot about this, or at least intimations of this, in George Marsden's excellent Fundamentalism and American Culture. But now modernists continued to look to science for scientific knowledge, but they continued to derive their morality from Scripture. And so fundamentalists and modernists, that was starting to fray, and there were certainly issues that they didn't agree on. But in terms of the basic conceptualization of what, let's call it, private justice or private morality looked like. See, that's, you can have it public justice and private justice, because remember, in the New Testament, righteousness and justice are the same word. Now, if I say righteousness, people tend to think of private morality. And if I say justice, people tend to think of public morality. But part of what's interesting in terms of the new rise of the woke religion is that people are getting increasingly more annoyed by it as they shift from public morality to private morality. And we'll get into this in a minute because I think there's a significant transition that took place. It's in the 1960s and the counterculture that the gap between what basically are the modernist and the fundamentalist, those both inside the church and outside the churches, really begins to come apart. But at that point, still in the culture, religious people weren't necessarily immoral. Some of that was starting to tick up in terms of some anxiety about wealth disparities in the West versus other places in the world, colonialism. I mean, a lot of that stuff starts coming up in the 60s and especially the 70s. And a lot of what we see is very much in continuity with that. But religious people weren't considered necessarily immoral. They were judgmental, unrealistic, and prudish. Now, the most significant again, this is an article for me, is just one of those things that just keeps on giving, how the civil rights movement converted white liberal Protestants to secularism. In a sense, it made the church inadequate, incompetent, no longer useful for certain degrees of white mainline people. As an experiential sense of justice, right and wrong, that wasn't mapping on the church institutionally, and so divisions weren't that neat. But the divisions that started in that movement have continued to play out today. But what's important to note is that even as these ideas of public justice have gotten more and more popular, and this is something that people have been noting for a long time, the mainline church has continued to shrink and shrink dramatically. You would think that adopting these ideas that are increasingly public, are popular in public, people would flock to the churches. But the point is sort of that, well, the battlefield is political. The church maybe will help with that, but not really. So the church is pointless. It's irrelevant. It doesn't do anything. If your main public justice mission is finally and fundamentally political, well, churches are only for the losers. Churches are only for people who have to sort of group up to make up for, basically, to keep a degree of counterculture identity from the broader culture. So in other words, win in the broader culture, lose in the church, and the institution shrinks. To a degree, this has also happened on the right, but not nearly to the same extent, partly because in a lot of ways, socially, the left has just continued to win. And I did a video on that as well. Now, some of these dynamics you can see in the, as Mark Knoll calls it, the Civil War as theological crisis, but the South lost the war. And as Marsden notes, a lot of what happened was the Northern Church wins, and the Southern Church all along the way just sort of continues to appropriate from the North, including fundamentalism, which basically gets started in the North, and the South appropriates it. Now, when you get into the 70s and the born-again movement, well, if the civil rights movement afforded an experience, a revivalistic experience of awakening, and that's the word, and you say, well, woke, awakening, that's the same word. Yeah, we're still dealing with this long tradition. You can see this in some of my past videos. Long tradition of awakenings in American culture. Now, we don't keep talking. We haven't kept numbering the Great Awakenings, but, you know, the author of this piece, I think, is exactly right, that in many ways, the civil rights movement was another Great Awakening, but it didn't manifest itself in church. And well, as Ross Douthat noted, and I've made this point a number of times in my previous video, Marianne Williamson, who ran for president, or Oprah, they didn't establish churches. They established separate platforms, and they relied on other platforms. Marianne Williamson, social media, publishing, Oprah, television. One of the big changes in the United States from the 19th to the 20th, and especially the 21st century, has been no longer having the church be a platform that promotes, but also disciplines and forms and guides. If you look at a lot of the moral panic in the evangelical community on this, you'll find it with someone, let's say, like Mark Driscoll, or Ted Haggard, who they might have a moral failure, something might happen, but they're so popular on other platforms, basically the church can't contain them. And evangelicalism is particularly adept at this because it's always sort of gotten around church structures. It's been so flush with non-denominational churches. Part of the reason that hasn't happened in the main line is because, generally speaking, the main line has simply been, you don't get disciplined hardly for anything in the main line. And so, but church discipline overall has pretty much collapsed. So what happens in the born-again movement is conservative evangelicals maintain their literalistic hermeneutic tradition, and the new born-again experience, comparable to the civil rights awakening, validates the continuity of God's work in the apostles as with today. And you very much see that in the Pentecostal and charismatic movements. Now, at the end of the Cold War, you have this precipitous decline in church attendance. Now, a lot of it comes, the main line just basically slides off, which demonstrates that in a lot of ways, the main line was buoyed by the Cold War, and the adoption and embrace of the civil rights Great Awakening was sort of an attempt to, well, not lose a lot of things, but in the end, it didn't work. At the end of the Cold War, now you have the rise of the new atheists. And what's interesting, and the reason I've got Christian Smith's book up here, which is a really important piece too, is that, about this same time, Christian Smith is doing his research on, well, where do Americans get their moral sentiments from? And to what do they attribute them? And they attribute them to their parents, but by and large, Americans think that their moral sentiments are self-evident. And this is exactly what we see in the New Atheist. It's just obvious what morality is, but I think as Tom Holland, and wait, I mentioned in one of my videos that I don't have a hard copy of Dominion, and so Rob, I just asked him to sign the copy for me. He wrote me a lovely little note. But he had read Dominion, and he said, "I'll give you my copy." And I said, "Wonderful." It's, I'm almost always buying 3 copies of books now. I buy the Audible version, I buy the Kindle version, and then if I love the book enough, I get the hardcover version. So Rob, thanks for the book, and it'll sit here with my go-to prop books. Soul Searching's in there too. There's Soul Searching right there. In the wake of 9/11, religion itself was morally critiqued and found wanting by the New Atheists. The religious, so that's Muslims and Christians, because, well, Muslims are the ones who brought down the building, but the Christians are all at hand, and it's exactly the same thing with all those religious people. The religious were no longer too moral, but were now immoral, as was their scripture and their God. You really didn't find that. You saw that beginning in the counterculture. And so this way you can see how these traditions sort of come together and blend together as they grow together and they intertwine in our culture. Now, when I talked to James Lindsay quite a while ago, one of the real takeaway of that was when he was telling me about Atheism Plus. So Atheism Plus came on the scene. Now remember, Professor DeMay is looking for a timeline here, and so this is sort of what I'm looking for too, and this is 2012. It's time for a new wave of atheism that cares about how religion affected everyone and that applies skepticism to everything, including social issues like sexism, racism, politics, poverty, and crime. Atheism Plus, also rendered atheism with a little plus sign, was a movement proposed in 2012 by blogger Jen McCrate. Its original definition was rather nebulous. In general, it encouraged progressive atheists to move beyond the definition of non-belief and to address additional issues including critical thinking, skepticism, social justice, feminism, anti-racism, and combating homophobia and transphobia. The idea originated as a reaction to the nastiness flung about during a controversy over sexual harassment policies at atheist skeptical conferences, which in turn was a reignition of the controversy over sexism in those two movements that had begun smoldering during Elevator Gate. And you can look that up. It's a very interesting episode. The initiative largely went nowhere. Well, see, I don't think it went nowhere. Again, pay attention to the question of institutions. Now, I got a really good comment from somebody who's like, yeah, but, institutions. My point is that we almost always institutionalize. And if something is going to have staying power, without individuals, nothing changes. Without institutions, nothing endures. We almost always institutionalize, but look at where and how we are institutionalizing, okay? And it's not in the church. It's just like we, in some way, saw the abandonment of churches in terms of change coming via prophets, publishing, radio, television. Well, what is the institution for atheism? It's a very different thing, the Freedom from Religion Society, but it's a very difficult thing to institutionalize. Your preachers are on YouTube and on the internet and in the publishing houses and on the speaking circuit. It's all these other platforms that are supporting the movement. And I wouldn't say the movement went away. I'd say the movement is as strong as ever. And so when you look at the likes of James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose and Peter Boghossian and their grievance studies, their hoax, well, it's right there you saw the split. And I didn't see that until I had that conversation with James Lindsay. It says the initiative largely went nowhere, as an institution, but the ideas are everywhere. And even proponents don't really use the term anymore. The phrase remains current, deployed, used as snarl words by Reddit anti-feminists. Oh, so now we're beginning to see the picture. But this is an old picture. Remember, Christians were called Christians first by their adversaries. Calvinists were called Calvinists first by their adversaries. Lutherans were called Lutherans first by their adversaries. That tends to be how naming goes. A snarl word, maybe that's what social justice has now become, a snarl word. Anti-feminists, Gamergate, Slime Pit, fans of Thunderfoot, I don't know any of these, and other assholes who are active in atheist circles. So I guess we know where the Rational Wiki stands on this. Others in the stream noted, Kevin DeYoung and Greg Gilbert's book, What is the Mission of the Church? Now, this is 2011, Making Sense of Social Justice, Shalom, and the Great Commission. Now, social justice by 2011, at least for Kevin DeYoung and Greg Gilbert, hadn't yet became a sneer word. But here I'll pop up another website. So this is 2010 by Glenn Beck. Now, again, pay attention. It's out of the confines institutionally of the church, and it's out-platformed television, radio, internet. What we've seen is a proliferation of platforms, and these things have pretty much escaped the church. Glenn Beck responds, social justice is a perversion of the gospel. I believe Glenn Beck's Mormon. It's so they basically quote him liberally here. To help set the record straight about what Glenn Beck did and didn't say previously, here are some quotes from and audio from last week. I beg you, look for the words social justice or economic justice in your church website. If you find it, run as fast as you can. Social justice and economic justice, they are code words. Now I am advising people to leave their church. Yes. Now pay attention again to the institutions. If you have a priest that is pushing social justice, go find another parish. I think he should say, if he's saying social justice, because again, these are code words. Well, code words for what? Excuse me, are you down with this whole social justice thing? Well, what is the social justice thing? Well, social justice now, later, has been repackaged, and you've got to be down with all of the things that Atheism Plus is down with, or you're not down with any of them. And we are now watching prominent evangelicals message this, and the tensions in the evangelical world are going to continue to be felt because the LGBT question, which is the thing that is sort of ripping churches apart, including my own denomination, is part of what's behind this. If it's my church, I'm alerting the church authorities. Excuse me, what's this social justice thing? And if to say, yeah, we're all in that social justice thing, I'm in the wrong place. And has become typical of these outside of church, so sojourners. Again, here's a platform. It's not subject to a church. It's out there sort of in the marketplace. Click here to tell Glenn Beck I'm a social justice Christian. So that's pretty typical of all of this activist stuff. Let's bombard Glenn Beck with this message. Now, the video that I put out, I'm going to put this out on Monday, so it'll be last week. Decaying Christianity, Causing Folk Religions, Political Polarization, and Successor Religion. That very much is what's happening here. Because again, church authority is pretty much gone. And it's interesting how people are hungering for more authoritative structures. Now, the churches that I see attempting to practice authority, it's very interesting. On one hand, they tend to be the Orthodox and the Roman Catholic, maybe some Anglicans who have bishops. And on the other side, Pentecostals. Authority has been a big buzzword in Pentecostalism for a very long time. My sister participated in a Pentecostal parachurch movement, and basically got out partly because all of this submission and authority stuff, well, it's over every part of your life. You're watching, let's say they're going to have the battle in the Southern Baptist Convention over women pastors, okay? The Christian Reform had that battle. Church had that battle in the 1990s. Yeah, what does it matter when, if you are a good writer and a good blogger or have a big YouTube channel, you have way more influence, way more power, potentially way more money, way more followers than all of these men who are leading local churches. It's just a fact. And it goes both ways. It's on both sides, because one of the ways that you can create a big YouTube following is to sort of play this sort of lineism. Here is the line, this is my side, and I'm just going to keep pointing my finger to the people on the other side of the line. That lineism game plays over and over and over again. And it's the same self-righteous game that gets you quite popular and can make you quite rich and can build you a big platform. So these are non-ecclesiastical platforms: publishing, television, radio, and now especially social media. Become an influencer. There you are. And it doesn't, only men are allowed to be on YouTube talking about religion. Really? Men, women, gay, straight, people of color, white. It's just completely open. Now, evangelicalism has basically been working this for a very long time. And the non-denominational churches, but this, of course, goes all the way back to the New England Congregationalist churches, the Calvinist churches, the Unitarian churches. I remember in seminary talking about, congregationalism it tends to be weak in terms of sort of maintaining a tradition. And so likely what we will see among many evangelical churches, and this is true of the right and the left, when, for example, the United Reformed Church split away from the Christian Reformed Church, they didn't have the kind of disciplinary powers that a denomination had. So they called themselves a federation. And so local churches, well, this has been a path in Christian ecclesiology for a very long time. Saw this with the rise of the moral majority. Francis and Frank Schaeffer, if you follow Frank Schaeffer on YouTube, although he joined the Orthodox Church, which is quite interesting, on Twitter, he's very resentful about the way things went in the 80s with his participation with people over on the political right. And Frank Schaeffer will tweet those things very reliably. Just follow him. Then you have the death of the main line. The main line has just basically been in a free fall for a very long time because, well, if all of your wins are political, the church as a platform doesn't really have much. Invest in publishing, media. Well, magazines are pretty much down, but television stations and the mass media in many ways have sort of taken this over. And so really, who needs church? Because you have all of your self-righteous, meaningful goodies watching your favorite television 24-hour news station, and there's your religious practice right there in front of the television, and both sides are playing it. One of the interesting transformations I've watched has been from the 60s to the 90s, and I think you can pretty much track this with the decline of church as authoritative, potentially disciplinary platforms, is Don't Judge Me. And my favorite example of this is White Lie Christmas from My Name is Earl. My Name is Earl, you can already see sort of the trajectory of spiritual but not religious. We're having our spiritual work outside of church bounds. And Don't Judge Me, Joy's mother has gambled away money that Joy needs for her family. And don't judge me, she'll say it again and again and again in the process of the episode. Well, that really has sort of turned the table now, because as we've seen, well, first it was public justice or social justice, and now as that movement continues to grow, now it has to be personal justice, and it's cancel culture, and it's you have to, well, you don't go, it's so good when John McWhorter, not a denizen of the right in terms of his politics, when John McWhorter goes to Austin and has people there bragging about how they have a person of color meet with them every week or every month to work with them on their racism, and they employ this, John McWhorter looks at them and says, they have a pastor. This is religion. Now, it's outside of institutional bounds, but John McWhorter, who is an atheist, looks at it and says, this is religion. It's the same dynamic. And he's exactly right. This is exactly what a lot of the non-atheist plus atheists have been saying as well. Now, the increasing complaint in the aughts has been against the spiritual and political left wing for their priggishness. We would expect to hear this in the 1960s about the right. But over the last 50 years, we've slowly watched this turn. One of the places to see this most clearly is in cinema. 1950s, you had Cecil B. DeMille's 10 Commandments, okay? And, I forget the name of that Hollywood movie recently. Was it Hail Caesar? I talked about it with one of the movie critics that I've had a conversation with. But take a look now at the complaints from a film critic like the Critical Drinker, who is continually looking at the fact that, well, now we have female Thor, and if you want to watch a pretty good takedown, a satirical takedown, watch female Thor at last. Marvel gives fans what they're looking for, right? And he notes that by and large, these movies are box office disasters. And what the Critical Drinker continues to complain about is incessant moralizing. Now, there's a really good video out there, Why Christian Movies Are Bad, the Problem with Christian Media. And a lot of his complaints in that video is about the art of filmmaking, but some of it's about the storytelling. Why have evangelicals made such horrible movies? I mean, they're trying to get out onto this film platform in order to promote their agendas, to promote conversion and morality and all of these things. Why are those movies so bad? Because there's a degree to which this is antithetical to storytelling. All of this moralizing and preachiness, well, it just doesn't, people just don't like it. Just like they didn't like it when it was the church or the priest or the pastor that was doing it. In fact, our language comes from the church. Movies are preachy. They're sermons, and the understanding is we don't like it. Now, one of the videos that I'm still ruminating on is to basically continue to develop the ideas that Jonathan Peugeot put out in his video about parasitic storytelling, where he notes that what these movies have to do is to continue to prop up the adversary in order for their movement to continue. You have to have white supremacy so you can continue to cast your role as the anti-racist crusader, hero, revolutionary against white supremacy. The problem is that when white supremacy goes away, you lose your identity. Same for feminism. And what we've seen again and again in these movements are they have to keep promoting them in order to keep casting themselves in the same role. Now, there's a lot going on there, and it has a lot to do with the history over the last 50 years. The parasitic storytelling will always bottom out. And why? Well, because it basically runs on the fuel of resentment. And resentment is not a good fuel for human beings. Resentment will burn through you and destroy your ability to maintain stable relationships around you. You will tend to become self-righteous, priggish, moralistic, and no one will be good enough for you. Now, as long as you have a little community of self-righteousness around you, and as a pastor, I see this dynamic in churches all the time because churches have been playing this. Well, this is what fuels you. But as Peugeot said, I should probably include that tweet here because I thought it was exactly right on. If you want to build a civilization, you cannot do it on words like dark or rebel or heterodox. By using these identifiers, you can criticize existing systems effectively, but you will never build anything of value and coherence. And he's exactly right. And so when you look at the Critical Drinker's complaints about all of these movies, this is his point. Now, he's not saying it this way, but he notices you can't tell stories effectively this way. You can tell stories that are fueled on resentment and grievance, but that only gets you so far. You can't actually accomplish anything. If your community is based on resentment and grievance, well, you can build a community and you can cohere them, but the coherence that you have is negative. Now, I also want to bring in John Vervaeke's excellent observations from his episode 13 about parasitic processing and Buddhism, about the agent-arena relationship and a number of these things. What Critical Drinker is feeling in the storytelling is something, he's sensing something, that the better the orientation, in a sense, the more air everything in the story has to breathe. The better all of the characters are, the better the story. And that's rather a fuzzy thing for us to get at, but we tend to notice a better story and a worse story. And that sort of makes me think that we have a similar dynamic to what John Vervaeke is talking about in terms of reciprocal narrowing, which is something that has to do with addiction, or reciprocal broadening, because anybody who works with addiction knows that the fuel of addiction is resentment. And one of the traps of this current culture war we have is that both sides get caught in these resentment dynamics. And in fact, what we see is that it's addictive. And now with the algorithms managing these social medias, basically for a very long time in the world, the chief way to make a lot of money in terms of a capitalist system is to sell something that's addictive. When tobacco comes on, the Columbian Exchange, 1493, tobacco comes in. Tobacco is tremendously popular. Why? It's addictive. Alcohol, tremendously popular. Why? It's addictive. We love addictive things because addictive things seem to go and go and go, but they are reciprocally narrowing. And so when the Critical Drinker keeps talking about the loss of storytelling, he's sensing the reciprocal narrowing that this addiction to grievance is doing to the storytelling, and it's killing these franchises. So if storytelling relies on grievance for fuel, it divides, diminishes, makes all of the characters smaller. It's basically like an addiction. It's reciprocal narrowing. Now, if you reciprocate, you're going to face the wokesters with your anti-wokeism, all of this reciprocates and it narrows, and it will narrow you down. Again, you can create a big following on one side or the other of this lineism, but in the end, it won't get you what you want, which is actually reciprocal broadening. With storytelling which expands, storytelling which breathes life, storytelling in which characters have more agency. And not just storytelling, but ourselves, because we are half physical, half story. Our own stories broaden. And this is what is being sensed in this culture war, and why the wokeism will finally get rejected. Just like this dynamic, it's the same as McCarthyism, it's the same as religious tyranny. All of these dynamics always lead into a hole, but the genuine article, the real thing, you have the reciprocal broadening dynamic. You have better storytelling. You have more agency. All of this works that way. So while you get annoyed with the woke stuff or the anti-woke stuff, don't give your heart to it. because you, the story part of you, is just going to get narrow. So the answer to bad storytelling is telling better stories. But as you'll notice, all of this priggish, moralistic narrowing has to go. And I think this is partly to the credit of Peugeot when he talks about the boundaries. And again, I've seen these dynamics in church forever. You can find them in deeply conservative churches. Deeply conservative churches actually go because part of them gets fueled by this resentment, and that actually lets the church's institution cohere. The mainline churches, they just basically have been swallowed by the other platforms, have become increasingly politicized, and have less and less in terms of actual life in them. But again, even for the mainline churches, usually what happens is that people continue, churches again split right and leak left. And what happens in the mainline churches, they go small, all the way down to almost nothing, especially if they don't have, let's say, they're not propped up by a state churches. It gets particularly bad. But they get down to nothing, and then you just have usually a conservative core that inherits the whole thing again. And so it often goes cyclical. But I do think about, well, why does Jesus not seem to, why does Jesus keep rising again in the world? And I think Tom Holland really put his finger on it in the Delling Pod podcast number 35. Imagine you've got to write a story in which for the first time, someone who suffers the excruciating death of a slave is going to be cast as being in some way part of the Creator God, who's fashioned everything, and he's got to be convincing, not just to people now, but for 2,000 years and across the whole span of the world. It's a really astonishing thing to have pulled off as a literary feat, and that 4 people did it is amazing. And my point following that is always, what do those 4 people have in common? They all wrote about the same guy. And I think you can see in this dynamic something that will actually point you to the truth. And you're not going to find it in grievance wokeism, and you're not going to find it in anti-wokeism. Again, Peugeot's tweet, I think, is dead on the money. If you want to build a civilization, you cannot do it on words like dark, rebel, and heterodox. By using those identifiers, you can criticize existing systems effectively, and they often need criticism, but you will never build anything of value. And this is what we see in Jesus. Jesus criticizes plenty. You can find that, but notice how he continues to change the dynamic, and the stories about him, again, if you talk to Critical Drinker, what type of story continues to go? It's always a Jesus figure. And we reclothe it, and we dress it up differently, and we add new surroundings, but that story continues to work. Maybe because it's the truest story. Maybe because it's the world story. Maybe, this story will finally beat this current crisis of reciprocal narrowing morality that we see around us. And it's the kind of story that, the point I made, I should probably make a clip of it, the point I made to Brett and Kale in my conversation with them, Jesus seems to keep losing, but winning in the long run. That's the kind of thing the gospel is. The difficulty we face with it is exactly in the Jesus story. Each of us as individuals loses, but together we win. Now, you can look at that archetypally, or you can look at that as really the way the world is laid out. But I think that's the truth of this. So yeah, social justice as a term is a bad name, and it's going to go away. What I'm really disturbed with is how the word justice has changed, because 40, 50 years ago, when you talk about justice, it almost always had to do with punishment. And I think it's going to go back that way again, but the word justice is going to have to be again recycled. And maybe if we get through this whole phase right now, we'll be a little smarter and a little better, and we'll know a little bit more. That's what I'm hoping anyway. All right, that's it for this video. Leave a comment. Let me know what you think. Curious about what you think.